What is up, everybody, and welcome to the first official movie review of 2025, and we're talking today about Peter Pan's Neverland Nightmare. This is the third film in the Poohniverse, the Twisted Childhood universe, I think is the other name for it. So the sequel, or the follow-up to Winnie the Pooh, Blood and Honey 1 and 2. And this movie's premise, the way that it is twisting the traditional Peter Pan lore and story into a horror slasher film, is that Peter Pan is essentially this guy that goes out and kidnaps and murders children under the promise of taking them to Neverland. And of course, you've got other characters in here like Mary Darling and Captain Hook and Tinkerbell to some degree that we'll discuss a little bit as we go on with the review. But this is yet another chapter in this universe that those of you that know my history with it certainly have a lot more context than I'll get into here, but it's a slate of films that I've certainly had a struggle to completely get on board with. But even with that being said, back whenever the Jagged Edge Productions had released a slate of films that they had planned to follow up Winnie the Pooh, Blood and Honey, including the sequel that has already come out, this film, the Bambi film, the Pinocchio film, and then, of course, the Poohniverse Monsters Assembled, the big team-up movie. Even before we had mended our fences, Peter Pan's Neverland Nightmare was the only one of the announced films that I actually thought might have some potential, because there's a lot of really sick, twisted things you could do with the Peter Pan lore if you flip that on its head. So I always had a little bit of inherent interest to what this movie was going to end up being. And if you do want to check this out, it's going to have a limited theatrical run, I believe from the 13th to the 15th. So Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday of this coming week. You should be seeing this review on Sunday the 12th. So if you want to check it out, you got a little window of time, and then eventually it will be released on VOD. And with all that being said, let's kick this review off and talk about the positives of Peter Pan's Neverland Nightmare. And the main thing that I will say is that I do think that there is some talent on display here as far as direction, as far as some really interesting shots, certainly as far as the gore. You know, Blood and Honey was an example of what these guys could do with an extreme small amount of budget, and Blood and Honey 2, I did think showed off their talents a bit more, and I think this continues that trend. Scott Chambers, who is the producer of the first two Blood and Honey films, he also played Christopher Robin in the second film. I believe he also has a hand in the writing, but don't quote me on that. This is his brainchild. He wrote and directed this film. And so I think that he shows some promise as a director. I think him and Reese as a creative team, they have different skills as directors that are on display so far, and it's going to be interesting to see which ones decide to take on which projects and which one of these two guys brings a certain flavor to these different films that are all supposed to be in a shared universe but have very different tones that they have been going for so far. So there's a lot of really interesting shots, especially in this film, that I appreciated that play on Peter Pan, but definitely have that dark edge to them. My favorite one being pretty early on in the film where you have Peter Pan in this little circus and he's standing there and his shadow silhouette is cast onto the ground, which is a very famous Peter Pan image because he would always chase his shadow. But it's done in a very twisted way where it's not a fun version of that. It's very much like an imposing type of shadow. And there's a few other shots like that, even an animated opening kind of in the vein of the original Blood and Honey that certainly feels like a creative staple to what these guys are doing so far. I also think performance-wise, everybody does a pretty good job here, some more than others. I think that the lead villain of Peter Pan, played by Martin Portlock, he does a really good job. Very sinister performance, very intimidating guy, definitely brings some personality to the role, so he very much embodies what they're going for this twisted version of Peter Pan. The main kidnapped child here, who is kind of your main source of like sympathy and somebody that you want to see survive, is played by Peter D'Souza, and I think he also does a very good job. If you come to these movies for the carnage candy, you get a good bit here. You have a scalping, you got stabbings, you got limbs being cut off. It is definitely a mean, bloody, gory film, and I think that the practical effects and the gore effects are pretty good here. They're all practical. There's no CGI blood that I could see, or at least they hit it very well, so I can appreciate that any day of the week. And one thing that I can say as far as a universe building element of this film is that I believe I read in an interview at some point that they're planning on Peter Pan being the main villain of the Poohniverse team-up movie. And so you're going to have all of these very twisted characters that are all antagonists teaming up against a common threat, I would assume. And it seems they've chosen that common threat to be Peter Pan, or at least they said in an interview at some point that was the idea. Whether that changes or not, we'll see when the movie comes out. If that ends up being the direction, I do think that they do a good job setting up Peter Pan as a character that, despite Winnie the Pooh and Tigger and all these other characters being absolutely depraved monsters in the previous two films, Peter Pan has elements to him where I could see an audience definitely being on the side of Winnie the Pooh and others and siding against Peter Pan and having him be the character where it's like, okay, he's definitely the more evil of the group. And so we're on board with taking him down and somewhat rooting for Winnie the Pooh and others, possibly, if that ends up being the direction. You know, Peter Pan is a very dark, sick, depraved character in this movie. They go for certain elements of what exactly his MO is that is pretty easy for everybody to get on board with, just despising this guy. So if that is indeed the direction they're going, I think that they made a wise choice in making him just an absolute despicable character that you really love to hate as far as the plans for the future of this franchise.
Wow. Who wants to come to Neverland with me?
Now, really quick before we move on with the rest of the review, with the new year comes not only a new slate of films, but a new slate of wellness goals. So if you need somebody to help with all of your meal prep, check out the sponsor of today's video, Factor Meals. It's a new year, and like pretty much everybody else, I'm focused on a new set of wellness goals. And if you're anything like me, the hardest part of that process is sticking to a good diet, because with my busy schedule, it is so much easier and more appealing to rely on takeout for a majority of my meals. Well, Factor Meals makes meeting your nutritional goals easier than ever with ready-to-eat meals that are chef-prepared and ready to eat in just 2 minutes. Strive towards your summer wellness goals with options like Keto, Calorie Smart, and Protein Plus. Factor's ready-to-eat meal delivery service takes the stress out of meal planning and sets you up for success. Skip the grocery store, the prep, and especially the cleanup, and enjoy chef-curated and dietitian-approved meals that are delivered right to your door. With over 34 chef-prepared and dietitian-approved meals, there's a variety of weekly options that will never allow you to fall victim to food fatigue. Plus, you can round out your meal and replenish your snack supply with over 55 different add-ons, such as apple cinnamon pancakes or fruit smoothies. So head to factor75.com or click the link below and use code 50CodyLeach to get 50% off plus free shipping on your first Factor box. That's code 50CodyLeach at factor75.com to get 50% off plus free shipping on your first Factor box. And thank you so much to Factor for sponsoring today's video. Moving on to the mixed, what I will say on the positive side is that they certainly picked a tone and went in that direction with this film. This is a very dark, serious, mean-spirited film. They are not having fun whatsoever. There is no campiness. There is no comedy in here. They are not playing up the silliness whatsoever. This is something where you are meant to be very much in a depraved situation, go through a depraved story, and have a character that is doing a lot of mean and nasty things. And at no point do they wink at the camera and try to break that tone at any point. Now, I think that that's the right direction to go if you want Peter Pan to be the ultimate antagonist by the end of this first phase, or whatever you want to call it, this first slate of films. However, my frustration and confusion that puts this in the mixed, and admittedly probably closer to the mixed negative side, is that I just don't, for the life of me, understand doing a concept like this and not just going full bore with the campiness and the silliness. Blood and Honey 1 was ultra serious and dark and mean-spirited. I think this film goes even further with that. But Blood and Honey 2 at least pushed things in a direction of winking at the audience a little bit more, having a little bit more fun with the concept. I still feel like they should have gone further with that. I still felt like the mix leaned too much into the seriousness with that second film, which is one of the main reasons why I still ultimately had to give it a negative review, which was a bummer. But I just don't understand from my perspective why you would have a Bambi movie and a Pinocchio movie and a Peter Pan movie and a Winnie the Pooh movie, and we're just more times than not going ultra serious with it, ultra dark, ultra mean-spirited. It just seems like that's not the right mix. Maybe I'm in the minority with that. Maybe most of the people that are fully on board for this and are loving this franchise and are cheering these guys on are saying the opposite. They're saying, get rid of the campiness. I want nothing but dark and craziness. I want this to be in my nightmares. Possibly. I'm not sure. I guess we'll find out in the comment section below. But I was really hoping that this movie was going to lean a little bit into that, being how fantastical Peter Pan and his lore and his side characters are. and they just went the opposite direction with it. So I can appreciate the fact they picked a tone and they stuck to it and didn't break it at all, but for me, it's the wrong tone. And I don't know how much of that was a conscious decision as far as the creative direction they wanted to go and how much of that was dictated by the budget. Because again, I did see an interview with Scott Chambers, the writer and director of this film, that said that initially the first script that they had for this, that he wrote alongside Matt Leslie, who was the writer of Winnie the Pooh, Blood and Honey 2 and the writer of Summer of '84, which is a movie I adore, they came up with something that was much more in that vein. It was much more fantastical. It was much more otherworldly. I would assume leaned a lot more into the silliness and the campiness of things. And I believe I'm quoting him directly when he said that he got cold feet because the budget that they had for this film was not going to allow him to realize that to the best of their abilities. So he decided to scale it back and go a different direction that would fit more with the money that they had. And again, I do think that despite it being disappointing that we're not getting that movie they initially had come up with, because I would assume is much more in the line of what I would have wanted, I do understand the business decision of making a film that fits your budget more, because too often we do see films that overreach what they're able to do and it just ends up disappointing. So I totally get why they did that if that was the sole reason they went this direction. It still ends up being a bit of a bummer for me. And one more thing that I'll mention here in the mix, which is kind of a carryover of something that I made note of in their second film, the Winnie the Pooh, Blood and Honey 2, and that's that these guys so far have really rode the line between homage and just overtly taking from something, where the characters in Winnie the Pooh, Blood and Honey 2, the personalities that they gave the animals seemed very derivative of other horror icons. Like Tigger was straight up a version of Freddy Krueger. I believe Owl was very reminiscent of Pinhead, things like that. And so you could feel the influence, obviously. You could see them paying homage to things that they love, but it was so on the nose, it was so overt that you very easily could have a lot of people just call it a ripoff, and I was very much in the middle on that. Like, I enjoyed it to a degree, but felt like it was a little bit just too much. And I find myself yet again in that place with a few elements of this film, where the majority of the movie really feels derivative of The Black Phone to me. Very similar type of premise. You have certain sequences in here where Peter Pan very much behaves like the grabber, and even just kind of the storyline of this kid trying to escape and the kidnap. Like, there's just a lot of direct ties to that. And even more so than that, there is a scene in the opening of this film that is straight up a version of the opening of It.
Peekaboo.
How did you get down there?
I'm Peter. It's nice to meet you.
Which, again, just feels so overt that it's obviously a homage, but it's almost like too much of an homage. It resembles the other thing more than it is its own thing. So again, I find myself kind of in the middle where, like, I appreciate that type of homage. I appreciate people giving a wink to their influences, but it just feels a little too overt still. I would like it to have more on the side of originality versus just reminiscing about something else. And now moving on to my main issues with the actual film that we got, and I really just have three significant issues here that held this back dramatically for me. The first one is that just as a story, I had a lot of questions. And again, I don't know if they're planning to answer a lot of these in the future or what, but there was just a lot of confusion in my mind with the story that we're going through here, with the motivations of Peter Pan, with why he kidnaps some children for the sake of the plot of the film, but others get murdered instantly. I didn't quite understand that. Like, what makes you value this person to keep them versus these others that are just dispensable, as well as how other characters in the Peter Pan lore tie into this, aside from them just needing to be there because it's Peter Pan. It's a very small scale story. It's very simple. Guy wants to kidnap and murder children, and the sister of one of the recently kidnapped victims is trying to find him. It's a very simple story. And so I felt like there was a lot more room to do things outside of that very simple story to kind of flesh out this world a little bit more, flesh out the Peter Pan side of things. And moving on from that into just the bigger issue, I don't even really think that the Peter Pan element is all that integral to the movie that we got. I think with an hour or two rewrite, you could remove all of the Peter Pan elements, and this is just kind of like a variation of The Black Phone, that has no resemblance to anything in this universe. And that's a disappointment for me, because I really think there's a lot you can do with the Peter Pan character, Tinkerbell, Captain Hook, to really integrate them into this story that you're trying to tell. And it just kind of feels like they're those characters in name only. And all of the elements of this film that ties it to Peter Pan, you could really easily dispense of, and the movie's not going to be affected all that much. You know, call the main kidnapper George, Tinkerbell can be Daisy, and Captain Hook can be removed entirely. And every single time he goes to kidnap one of these kids, he just doesn't make any reference to taking them to Neverland. He says, you know, I have candy in my van. And the movie is essentially 90% the same, which again, might just be the plan of we're going to touch on it here and we'll expand it significantly in the sequel. But I felt like there was more room to do stuff like that here. I was interested on how this version of Peter Pan, if at all, actually ties into what we know as the real Peter Pan. He's literally reading the story to kick off this film. So the Peter Pan story is existing in this world. You have Tinkerbell in here that just seems like somebody who just took the name of Tinkerbell. Captain Hook really felt like was just there out of obligation. There was no character there. And so I just wanted more out of that. That was the one element of this movie that I had the most interest in, that gave me the most faith in this project of all of the ones that were announced for this slate of films. And to me, it just felt like it was like a quarter measure when I really wanted a full measure of that. I also found myself a little bit puzzled with an element of the story here where it seemed like this movie was setting things up to make some sort of a commentary or a statement on the LGBTQ community with a lot of character elements that are revealed throughout the film. And perhaps it was never meant to be that. Perhaps it was just the point of inclusion, and that's fine. If I read that as an explanation, I would totally just accept that and move on. But the movie seemed so deliberate with certain things that it reveals about its characters throughout the entire film, and multiple characters, the majority of the cast, honestly, that much like with the Peter Pan lore, I was waiting for something to be built off of that. Like maybe Peter Pan's motivations of taking these kids away to a better land was going to be some kind of a way that they tie into how a lot of people feel disenfranchised by others, or they feel like an outsider if they're a part of that community. Something like that, that felt like very obvious ties into the story they were telling to make some sort of a commentary. And it just never came. So it just felt strange to me that it never came. Not to say that a movie like this needs to make a commentary. I think most people that watch it probably would not want it to. But there seemed to be just such a deliberate forward momentum in the things that they were pushing in that direction that for it to ultimately not go anywhere and not lead to anything just felt a little odd to me. And so really all my main negatives with this film pretty much boils down to the writing. And I think that that's attributed to the very fast turnaround that they're trying to do with these films, with this universe. I mean, they're trying to put out what's going to end up being, 6 or 7 films within like 2.5 years. That's a lot. And all the same creative team building them. And I think even more so the fact that they had one direction, they had one script, one story idea, and then they scrapped that, went in a totally different direction on already a pretty tight production schedule, pretty tight turnaround. I think those two elements, more than anything else, led to just some weakness in the script here. So where I really had a lot of interest in what they were going to do narratively with this, what they were going to do with the lore, with these characters, that ended up being my biggest disappointment. So all in all, what I will say is that if you're a fan of these movies so far, I don't see any reason why you would not enjoy this. It's very much in the line of what they have done so far, but continuing to grow as far as direction and with the gore effects and things like that. If you're somebody that did not appreciate the inherent silliness of Blood and Honey 2 and you want something that's more on the dark, serious side, this is absolutely going to be the movie for you. But if you're somebody like me that has still been waiting for them to kind of go even more in that campy direction, I think the direction they decided to go with this film is probably going to be not what you expect and not what you want from these characters. So as a lower budget kidnapper slasher film, I think that there's some entertainment to be had here. It's worth checking out if this is your thing. As a film and so far a franchise that just seems to promise a lot more, I was a bit disappointed with what I got on that end of things. Well, that's it for this one, guys. If you enjoyed that, please click over here for all of my reviews of this universe so far. Click down here for all the 2025 new release reviews so far, which if you're watching us on release is one film. Like, share, hit that subscribe button so you can go through the rest of 2025 on this wild journey of movies with me. And as always, remember, opinions are like assholes, but that doesn't mean you have to be.